The election in Georgia is already underway. Over 132,000 people have already returned their absentee ballots, and about 1.4 million have requested absentee ballots in advance of Election Day. By November 3rd, we could be having as many as 2 million absentee ballots returned in an election that's expected to break turnout records. Absentee voting became a primary way that voters cast their ballots this year because of the coronavirus pandemic. People stayed away from the polls and started voting from home much more often. But the quick rise of absentee voting introduced many questions about how to make sure your vote counts when it has to be returned and whether it will make a difference. I'm Mark Niesse. I'm the AJC's Elections and Voting Rights reporter, and this is the first in our series of live Facebook chats about the upcoming election. In this one, we'll answer some of the most frequent questions about absentee voting. After the number of absentee voters jumped in the primary and is expected to continue to be pretty high in the general election. In past elections, 5 or 6% of people voted absentee. In the June primary, that number reached almost 50% of voters. So it's a big thing, it's a new thing, but a lot of people are doing it. Before we talk more about absentee, let's talk about what's coming up. We have our voter registration deadline on Monday, this coming Monday, October 5th. Then in-person early voting is October 12th, the week after. Mandatory Saturday day of in-person early voting, October 24th. Election day, November 3rd, and then we might have a little bit of a wait while all the ballots are counted and we know final results, but the election has to be certified by November 20th. And then hopefully we'll know who has won by then, both in Georgia and across the country. In Georgia, we've had absentee voting for everyone without having to provide a reason or an excuse since 2005. Georgia is not one of the states that has changed its absentee voting laws this year because of the coronavirus. What's changed is that more people are using the process that was already in place. In the past, absentee voting was more often used by older Georgia voters or people just who preferred the convenience of it. But because of coronavirus and because of the desire to give people more options and to advertise it, more people are using it. Before the primary, Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger's office sent absentee ballot applications to 6.9 million Georgia voters, and many of them returned those absentee ballot applications and went on to vote absentee. And that trend seems to be continuing to a large extent in November. This time around, you aren't going to see absentee ballot applications from the state, but other organizations are doing the same thing, sending absentee ballot applications from both the right and the left. I've seen absentee ballot applications arrive in the mail with President Donald Trump's name and picture on it. I've also seen one from other outside groups and targeting their kind of voters who they want to get to the polls. It depends where you're coming from, but everybody wants to get their voters out. And so you are getting a lot of mail with absentee applications, but that is not from formal official government sources. It is legal. It is a fine way to request your absentee ballot. There is official ways to do it too. The state has an online website, ballotrequest.sos.ga.gov, where you can request your absentee ballot just by typing it in your name and driver's license number and county on a website. And you can also submit a paper form to your county's election office. Then returning your absentee ballot. There are a few ways to do that too. A new innovation this year is drop boxes. These are boxes set up across the state, not in every county, but in many counties and especially in cities, you see a lot of drop boxes available, and we've created a map where you can find drop boxes in the Metro Atlanta area. If you search Dropbox map, you'll probably find it, or search for AJC absentee ballot Dropbox, and you can find that map, and we'll update that as more Dropboxes come online. But Dropboxes, they look like mailboxes. They're places where you can return your absentee ballot, and it will be picked up by an election official and then counted on election day. You can also return your absentee ballot by mail, or you can deliver it in person to your county's elections office. What you can't do necessarily, unless there's a drop box at that location, you can't just give your absentee ballot to a poll worker at a voting location. You have to put it in a drop box or mail it in or return it at a county elections office. If you mail it, you are supposed to attach postage. Here's my absentee ballot. It arrived just a few days ago in my mailbox. It says apply first class mail postage here. First class mail postage, first class stamp, it should be sufficient in most cases. Really, you should feel pretty confident that a first class stamp will be enough, because in addition to that, the U.S. Postal Service has a policy that it will deliver election mail. I do hear problems on occasion where people say their ballot was returned or not delivered for whatever reason, and that's part of the reality of the Postal Service, but most of the time your absentee ballot will go through. In addition, we have an open debate about when you have to get your absentee ballot in. Georgia state law says absentee ballots have to be returned and received by election officials by 7 p.m. on election day. However, a federal judge ruled at the end of August that absentee ballots only had to be postmarked by election day and received within 3 days afterward. That ruling is being appealed. Hopefully we'll know with some more clarity in the coming days. That appeal is coming right up. We have a reader question that I want to address. Please send in your questions. I want to be as informative as I can, and frankly, it's a lot easier if I can be responding to readers and telling them what they want to know rather than just hearing myself talk. So this question is about the state's new website, not the ballot request website, but a new site to track your absentee ballot. It's called Ballot Tracks. You can find it at georgia.ballottracks.net, and it will help you track the progress of your absentee ballot. What it does is it sends you text message, email, or voicemail notifications as your absentee ballot moves through the process. It will send you one notification when your absentee ballot has been issued and other notifications when it has been returned and accepted. And when your absentee ballot has been accepted, you're good to go. You know that your signature has been verified and that it will be counted. Now the question is, when you get the message that your absentee ballot has been accepted and your vote is being counted, does that mean your ballot has been scanned? What it means is that it has been scanned as received at the county election office. Then they have, but it's still usually in the envelope. In Georgia, we also have a new procedure this year, a new innovation that does allow election officials in the counties to start opening and scanning the ballots themselves 2 weeks and a day before election day. However, they can't actually count the ballots. They can't push the button that will tabulate those ballots until after polls close on election day. But the purpose of that is to give election officials more time to go through this huge pile of mail to be able to get the ballots scanned and ready to be counted on election night. So when you get that notification from Ballot Tracks, your ballot hasn't been scanned yet, your envelope has been scanned, but your ballot will be scanned usually closer to election day. Each county does things differently. Some counties might choose not to begin processing absentee ballots 2 weeks and a day before election day. Some might wait a little bit longer. Some might wait until election day or afterward, depending on the size and processes of each county. But pretty sure that the larger counties, especially in Metro Atlanta, will have so much absentee ballot mail, they're going to want to start moving through that list. And then the absentee ballots that they'll be stuck having to count afterward are the ones that they will receive closer to election day or on election day itself, or even later if the judge's ruling to allow those to be accepted is upheld. But again, we don't really know what's going to happen. We don't know the deadline. The safest thing to do is get your ballot in early. That way you don't have to worry about potential mail delays. And it's much more likely that your ballot will be counted and counted promptly. I do want to take some other questions, but first I want to talk about absentee ballot trends, what we're seeing so far. It's really interesting. The Secretary of State's office on their website every night at about 11:30, 11:45 p.m., they have an updated list, a spreadsheet of everyone who has requested an absentee ballot in Georgia. And I download that and look at the numbers, and it's fascinating to see how it's changing day by day. As I said before, we're at about 100.4 million absentee by mail applications so far. We're up to about 28 or 29,000 people a day requesting absentee ballots. And now we're getting to about 33,000 a day returning their absentee ballots. And those numbers are still rising. You saw pretty consistent requests for absentee ballots as soon as the absentee ballot website went up a couple of weeks ago. And now that people are paying close attention and we're into the debates, we're really seeing it pick up. I don't know when it'll stop picking up. At some point, people will have to plan not to vote absentee as we get closer to Election Day, because you do have to leave some time for your ballot to be sent to you. But now we're 5 weeks plus out, and there is still plenty of time to request and return an absentee ballot. What is interesting is I went through and compared the people who have requested absentee ballots for the general election and with the people who voted in the primary. And in a primary, you don't have to, but you usually do decide on a political party ballot. So I matched people's voter registration numbers who have requested absentee ballots for November with their registration numbers from whether they voted and what party they voted previously. And from that, you can see that so far among those 1.4 million who have requested absentee ballots, about 60% of them who pulled a partisan ballot voted Democratic Party ballots in the primary, 38% voted Republican Party ballots in the primary, and 2% voted a nonpartisan ballot. However, that leaves out the biggest category of all, people who didn't vote in the primary and are now planning to vote absentee in the general election. That's about 535,000 people, new voters who didn't vote in the primary, didn't choose one party's ballot or the other, who are now going to be voting in the general election. So those numbers don't necessarily indicate that one party is leading or not, but it does give you a little bit of a sense of how things are going so far. We got a great question. How long will it take for absentee ballots to be counted? That is a great question. I really think that everyone should prepare for the counting of absentee ballots to take some time. Yes, we will get some election results on election night, and some of those will include absentee ballots that were returned in advance of Election Day and were processed and ready to go by 7 p.m. on election night. But so many people wait until nearly the end. So many absentee ballots are going to be arriving. I think it's going to take election officials days to get through them all. If you think about it, even a big county like Fulton County, for example, they're going to have tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of ballots to deal with. And even with a large staff of dozens of poll workers, how many of those can you scan per minute and per hour? It just takes time to open them, to verify the signatures, and then to scan each individual ballot through the scanners. And yes, the scanners do have some capacity to scan ballots in stacks, for example, but still, it takes some time. So I think everybody should be prepared, especially in a close election, that we won't know final results in some races, maybe even presidential races or Senate races or U.S. House races on election night. And that's the way the process is supposed to work. Absentee ballots have been around for years. It has always taken some time to count the late arriving absentee ballots. And those ballots have to be counted. It isn't that you vote on election day and that's the end of the election. State law gives county election officials, I believe it is, I'm trying to remember, yes, 10 days to count and certify county election results. And then the Secretary of State's office has another week after that to finalize statewide results. This is the process. You have to go through the ballots. You have to make sure they're accurate. You have to verify them. And verifying signatures, verifying voter information, opening and scanning absentee ballots does take longer than just tabulating ballots cast on touchscreen voting machines and scanned on optical scanners on the poll on election day. Another very good question. If you request an absentee ballot but never receive it, but the absentee ballot tracking system says you have, can you still vote in person? So a couple things to note there. The Ballot Track's website does not track when you receive your ballot. It tracks when your ballot is issued and when it's returned and when it's accepted. So there is not Postal Service tracking through that Ballot Track's website, georgia.ballottracks.net. So the system will only show if you've been issued a ballot, and it will show if it has been returned by you and received by the elections office. So the real question is, what if you're looking on Ballot Tracks or on the Secretary of State's website and you see that your ballot hasn't been marked as received by election officials? So in that case, you can go in and vote in person. It's not recommended. I mean, of course, everybody has a right to vote. Generally speaking, it's better to pick one way of voting and stick to it and get your vote in advance. But I totally understand and sympathize with people who, especially if you did return your absentee ballot in advance and it still doesn't show up as having been received. So in that case, you can vote in person. You do have to cancel your absentee ballot at the polling place. The poll worker will help you do that. You sign a form, you swear an oath that you haven't voted twice and that you are who you say you are. They have to check with the county election office to make sure they haven't received your absentee ballot. So if they do receive it later, it will not be counted, and instead your in-person vote will be counted. It also helps if you do have an absentee ballot and let's say you change your mind and you want to vote in person, bring your absentee ballot with you to the polls to cancel it and vote in person. That makes the process go a good bit faster. So you can, it's a little bit of a hassle. It's better to make a plan now. Do you want to vote absentee? Do you want to vote early in person starting October 12th? Or do you want to vote on election day, November 3rd? And if you plan the way you want to vote in advance, there's a very, very high chance that you'll be able to vote with ease, not have to wait in lines, and have your vote be counted. Here is a question. This question, if you order an absentee ballot but decide to vote in person instead, can you? Yes, you can. Again, it depends how you do it. If you receive your absentee ballot but then decide you want to vote in person, it does help the election officials and it helps you by saving time if you bring your absentee ballot with you to the polls. Then a poll worker can see that you have an absentee ballot, cancel it on the spot. They still do have to go through the process of canceling your absentee ballot, but then they can issue you a in-person voter access card to vote on touchscreens and vote on, and then you get your ballot printed out at the polling place and deposit it into the optical scanner. So that is an option. And you can do that, especially if you're worried that you received your ballot too late or it won't be accepted. But generally speaking, if you are concerned, you can return your absentee ballot early and see that it has been accepted, or just plan to vote during early voting. I expect usually the pattern is almost always the same. Early voting starts a little bit slow, and then by the final few days, you have lines at early voting locations. But early voting lasts for 3 weeks. If you go in one of the first 2 weeks, there's a pretty good chance that you'll be able to get in and out pretty quickly. And we do have some large early voting sites. If you live in Fulton County, they have that voting site at State Farm Arena. I believe it has 100 voting machines set up, maybe even more than that. It's a large area able to handle a lot of voters at a time. There are also other areas like DeKalb County has some large facilities, and other counties are setting those up as well. And you can find those locations. We'll post some of them when early voting begins on ajc.com, but you can also look for early voting locations either on the My Voter page, which is the Secretary of State's page that has all your information, your early voting locations, your precinct locations, sample ballots, absentee ballot status, and that website, a great resource, www.mvp.sos.ga.gov. Yes, so let's move on to concerns about absentee voting. I addressed the slow count. We do just have to be ready for that. I think the more people are prepared for this count to drag on for a few days, the less anxious they'll be. I think that's something that I and people watching this, voters who are informed, I think that's good voter education information. If you want to vote, if you want to make sure that you're not panicking on election night, tell your friends and family, look, we'll get some results on election night, but that isn't necessarily the end outcome. All ballots have to be counted. Quickly, I wanted to touch on absentee ballot rejections because that is a concern. Absentee ballots can be rejected for two main reasons. One is if you return it too late, past the deadline. And then, as I said before, we don't know exactly what the deadline is going to be because state law says it's 7 p.m. on November 3rd. A judge said it's postmarked on November 3rd and returned 3 days afterward. The courts will rule on that pretty quickly, I anticipate, but we don't know it yet. So get your ballot in on time, regardless of the deadline. You can be sure I and the AJC will cover that very thoroughly. The other thing, your ballot can be rejected if you don't sign or print your name. So it's important to sign your name and print your name. If you leave that blank, or if someone who is not you signed it, the election officials will look at the signature, match it with your voter registration or absentee ballot application, and if it isn't the same, they'll reject your absentee ballot. However, state law gives you time to fix your absentee ballot. Election officials have to contact you and give you an opportunity to prove you are who you say you are and have your absentee ballot counted. There are concerns about signatures today not matching what they were in the past, and that does come up in some cases, but at least in this year's primary, rejection rates for signature mismatch or missing signatures were really low. They were a bit higher in 2018, but that was kind of a wake-up call to many local election officials who realized they needed to be more efficient and also more consistent in how they applied voting standards. Good. And I wanted to talk about what I'm doing. I've voted in person in the past. I voted absentee in the primary. I decided to request an absentee ballot for the general election as well, which you can see here. You get your envelope. This is very important to return with your ballot inside. Then there's a second envelope. This is a privacy envelope. You don't need to sign it, but it is an envelope for your ballot. And then the ballot itself. I do like voting in person. I think it's a fun experience, but not if you're in line for a long time. And after voting absentee in the primary, I just saw how easy it was. I understand the worries. And if you're worried about absentee voting, don't do it. Vote however you feel comfortable. For me, though, it was so simple. You sit down at your kitchen table, you fill it out, and then you put it in a drop box or put it in the mail, and you're done. You don't have to worry about lines. You don't have to worry about potential traffic. You don't have to take time out of your workday. But again, If you don't like absentee voting, if you don't think it's trustworthy, vote in person. Vote however you feel is right for you. And that's why Georgia state law gives us options about how to cast any ballots, whether in person or absentee. We do have one more question I see. Yeah, and this is kind of a similar question to one we had before. So I'll skip over it. It was about voting in person after receiving an absentee ballot. You can do that. There is a process to do it. There's also a question, how often are absentee drop boxes checked? The state election board approved absentee ballot drop boxes in the spring. That's when they started for the primary. For the general election, they continued that rule, allowing drop boxes. Absentee ballot drop boxes are emptied at least once every 3 days at this point in the process. And these drop boxes do have to be secured. The rule requires them to be bolted to the ground. They have to be checked once every 3 days, and they have to be monitored 24 hours by video to prevent any issues, make sure nobody's stealing ballots or anything. As we get closer to the election, I don't recall the exact day. I believe might be the 2 Mondays before the election, although don't take my word for it, but close to the election, the rule requires election officials to empty drop boxes at least once every 24 hours. So that's all the time we have today. I hope this was interesting and informative. In future sessions, we hope to have guests. We hope to have voting machine demonstrations. We're going to talk about early voting. We're going to talk about turnout. We're going to talk about voting trends. We're going to talk about Georgia as a battleground state. So stay tuned. We will be here at 5 o'clock every Thursday leading up to the election. Thank you for joining us. This is our first AJC Facebook chat on the 2020 election. We hope to continue it going. Voting is democracy's most powerful tool in this historic election year. And it's exciting because all voters play a part in it. More than anything on TV, more than anything, it's participation, it's democracy in action. And we expect 5 million voters in this election, which will be a new record. So please continue watching and read our coverage on ajc.com and in the print newspaper of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Thank you.